Welcome to Tales by Imon. In this first chapter, we step into the life of the lighthouse keeper, who has lived a solitary existence, far away from the hustle of the world. His name is John Carter, and his story begins in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world outside the lighthouse is swallowed by the night. John Carter had been the lighthouse keeper for over 15 years. The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff, where the land met the restless sea. It was a place of solitude, of quiet contemplation, and of duty. John had never asked for this life, but he had come to accept it as his own. The only sounds he ever heard were the waves crashing against the rocks and the occasional calls of seabirds. Yet, despite the isolation, there was a peace in the routine that John had grown to cherish. His days were long, and they blended into one another. Each morning, he would climb the stairs of the lighthouse tower, polish the glass lens, and check the oil lamps to make sure the light would guide ships safely through the night. His hands were callous from years of maintenance, and his eyes, though aged, still had the sharpness that allowed him to see the faintest flicker of light on the horizon. But tonight, something was different. John stood at the window of the lighthouse, gazing out over the sea. The wind howled, and the waves crashed against the rocks below. A storm was approaching, the kind of storm that sent even the bravest sailors to seek shelter. He had been keeping an eye on the sky all evening, and the dark clouds had only thickened as the hours passed. The sea was churning in a way he had never seen before. There was an unusual intensity to the storm, a kind of menace that sent a chill down his spine. He had seen many storms in his years as the lighthouse keeper. He had weathered hurricanes and gales that could tear a ship apart, but this one felt different. The storm seemed to be alive, a force of nature that was not content to simply pass through. It wanted to stay, to test the limits of the lighthouse, to challenge the strength of the old keeper who watched over the sea. John's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He turned, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came here, not unless there was an emergency. His eyes narrowed as he moved toward the door, every muscle in his body on alert. He opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. Instead, a small package lay on the doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, and had no return address. John picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. There was something about the package that seemed off. He couldn't explain it, but a sense of unease washed over him. After a moment's hesitation, John brought the package inside. He set it down on the small table by the window and examined it closely. The paper was old, the edges worn, as though it had been through a great deal before reaching him. He reached for the twine, untangling it carefully, and then peeled back the paper. Inside was a leather-bound book, its cover faded and cracked with age. The book seemed oddly familiar, though he was sure he had never seen it before. The pages were yellowed with time, and as he opened the first page, he saw the words, "The Lighthouse Keeper's Log," written in elegant handwriting. John's heart skipped again, but this time for a different reason. There was something strange about the book, something that felt almost prophetic. It was as though the book had been waiting for him, that it had been sent here for a purpose. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an undeniable pull to read it. And so, he did. The first entry was dated nearly 100 years ago, written by a man named Samuel Gray. John began reading, intrigued by the mysterious words that spoke of another lighthouse keeper, someone who had once stood in the very place where he now stood. The words were a testament to the man's life, his trials, and his experiences. As John read on, he became absorbed in the story. It was as though the words were calling to him, guiding him towards something he couldn't yet understand. Samuel Gray wrote about strange occurrences, unexplained noises in the night, lights flickering at odd hours, and a growing sense of something sinister lurking just beyond the horizon. The entries became more cryptic, as though the keeper was struggling to make sense of the terrifying things he had witnessed. The last entry, dated just days before Samuel Gray had disappeared, was chilling. "I fear I have been cursed by the very lighthouse I have sworn to protect. The storm is coming, and with it, something worse. I pray someone will find my log and stop what is about to happen." John's hands trembled as he closed the book. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The storm outside was growing fiercer, and a feeling of dread had settled over him like a heavy cloak. Something was wrong, something that went beyond the natural world. The storm, the book, the strange sense of foreboding, it was all connected. He glanced out the window again, his eyes scanning the dark, swirling ocean. In the distance, he thought he saw a flicker of light, moving in and out of view. A ship? Or was it something else? As the wind howled louder, John Carter knew that his life was about to change. The lighthouse had always been a symbol of safety, a beacon in the storm. But tonight, it felt as though it had become something much darker, something that had come to claim him. The storm was here. The storm raged outside, its fury unmatched by any of the storms John Carter had encountered in his 15 years as the lighthouse keeper. The wind howled like a beast trapped in a cage, slamming against the stone walls of the lighthouse as though it were trying to tear the building apart. The ocean below churned, its waves crashing against the cliffside with terrifying force. John stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. His heart raced, though he wasn't sure whether it was the storm itself or the weight of the book in his hands that caused the unease that crept through his chest. The log he had found, the entries written by Samuel Gray, had stirred something deep within him, a feeling of dread, a sense that something was not quite right. The book had warned of a storm, yes, but it had spoken of more than that. It had spoken of a curse, of something that lay hidden in the shadows of the lighthouse, waiting to awaken. The last entry had been particularly haunting. Samuel Gray had known something was coming, something terrible, and now John found himself wondering if that something was already here. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the lower level of the lighthouse. John spun around, his heart thudding in his chest. The noise had come from the door to the lighthouse cellar. The storm had been battering the building all evening, but this noise was different. It wasn't the wind, it was something solid, something that had collided with the door from the inside. John hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening around the book. The cellar was a place he rarely visited. It housed old supplies, tools, and other items that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would go unless they had to. But tonight, something told him he had to go. He moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the lighthouse. The door to the cellar was made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron. He had always felt secure behind it, knowing that no matter how fierce the storm outside, the lighthouse would keep him safe. But now, the door seemed like an ominous barrier, one that separated him from whatever waited within. Another bang came from the cellar, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping sound, as though something, or someone, was moving around down there. John's pulse quickened. There was no logical explanation for the noise. No animals, no storm debris, nothing that could have made that sound. But deep down, he knew that logic had little place in the events unfolding tonight. With a deep breath, John placed his hand on the cold brass handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, narrow staircase leading down into the cellar. The air was damp and musty, the scent of mildew and salt water thick in the air. As he descended the stairs, the wind outside seemed to grow even louder, as though it were calling to him, urging him to turn back. But he couldn't. The curiosity, the unease, the strange pull he felt, he had to know what was happening. He had to understand the connection between the book and the storm, the warning that Samuel Gray had left behind. The cellar was colder than the rest of the lighthouse, the stone walls damp with the saltwater mist that rose from the ocean below. John's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating old crates and barrels that lined the shelves. The soft scraping sound continued, coming from the far corner of the cellar, near a large stack of wooden crates. John's breath caught in his throat. There, in the corner, a figure stood. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the dim light. At first, John thought it was a trick of the light, but as he moved closer, he could make out a shape, a person, or at least, something that resembled a person. The figure seemed to be leaning over something, its hands moving quickly, almost frantically. "Who's there?" John's voice trembled, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned toward him, slowly, deliberately. John froze, his blood running cold as he saw the face of the figure for the first time. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. But his skin was pale, almost ghostly white, and his eyes were empty. Hollow, dark. John couldn't tell if the man was alive or dead, if he was real or a figment of his imagination. But one thing was certain, the figure wasn't supposed to be here. John took a step back, his heart racing. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it pointed toward the far corner of the cellar, where a small, rusted chest sat. The lid was slightly ajar, as though it had been opened recently. The figure's hand trembled as it pointed, its bony fingers extending toward the chest. John's mind raced. He knew the chest. It had been in the cellar for as long as he could remember, a relic from the days when the lighthouse was first built. He had never thought much of it, never dared to open it, thinking it was nothing more than a forgotten relic of the past. But now, standing before the shadowy figure, he realized that whatever was inside that chest was the key to understanding everything that was happening. "Don't open it," the figure rasped, its voice a hoarse whisper that sent a chill down John's spine. The word sent a jolt of fear through John's body. He had to open it. He didn't know why, but the chest was calling to him, just as the book had. There was something inside that he needed to see, something that would explain the storm, the curse, and the figure standing before him. But as he stepped forward, reaching for the chest, the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with an unnatural strength. John gasped, struggling to break free, but the figure's grip tightened, its hollow eyes locked onto his. "Don't make the same mistake I did," the figure whispered, its voice now trembling with an urgency that sent a shiver through John's soul. The storm outside howled louder, and the ground beneath John's feet seemed to shake. The lighthouse groaned, its foundation rattling with the force of the wind. The figure's grip was unrelenting, and John knew that whatever was inside the chest was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. With one final, desperate pull, he wrenched his arm free from the figure's grasp and staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure stood motionless, watching him, its eyes empty and dark. John didn't look back. He turned and bolted for the stairs, rushing up into the safety of the lighthouse tower. But as he reached the top, he knew that the storm was only the beginning. Something darker, something far more dangerous, had been unleashed, and it was coming for him. The lighthouse, once a symbol of safety and light, had become a prison that he might never escape. John Carter's breath came in ragged gasps as he scrambled up the spiral staircase of the lighthouse, his heart still pounding from the encounter in the cellar. The storm outside continued to batter the lighthouse, its force shaking the very walls of the building. But in that moment, the storm was nothing compared to the terror that had gripped him since he first laid eyes on the figure in the cellar. As he reached the top of the stairs, he rushed to the lantern room, where the massive glass lens of the lighthouse towered above him, its steady beam cutting through the dark night. The light flickered as the wind howled outside, and John's hands shook as he grabbed the control wheel to adjust the beam. But the action felt mechanical, distant. His mind was far from the task at hand. What had he just seen? The figure, the warning, the chest. It all made no sense. John could feel the weight of the book still heavy in his pocket, as though it were pressing him toward some unavoidable fate. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. But there was nothing. John tried to steady himself. He knew he had to stay calm, but his mind raced, spinning with questions and dread. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the storm? Or had the figure, the curse, somehow manifested before him? The storm outside was growing more intense by the minute. The sky had turned pitch black, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the ocean below. The waves crashed violently against the cliffs, as though the sea itself was in a frenzy. As John gazed out the window, his thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a soft thud that seemed to come from below. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make him freeze in place. The sound was followed by another thud, and then a low scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. His pulse quickened. "Not again," John muttered under his breath. He stepped back from the window, his heart racing in his chest. The noises were coming from somewhere below, from the ground level of the lighthouse. He hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or to stay where he was. But the curiosity, the same pull that had led him to the book and the cellar, urged him forward. John grabbed a flashlight and made his way back down the winding stairs, the light casting long shadows across the narrow walls. As he descended, the noises grew louder. Thuds, scrapes, and an eerie, muffled sound that seemed almost like whispering. The cellar door stood at the bottom of the stairs, its wooden frame now creaking under the pressure of the wind. John hesitated before he reached for the handle, his fingers cold with fear. He had to know what was happening. He had to understand what had been unleashed in this lighthouse. He opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding like a warning. The cellar was as dark and damp as it had been before. But now, there was something else, a feeling of being watched. A weight in the air that pressed on his chest. John shone his flashlight across the room, his eyes scanning the shadows. The strange figure from earlier was gone, but the chest remained. The lid was now fully open, the rusted metal hinges screeching in protest. But it wasn't the chest that caught his attention. No, it was the ground around it. The floorboards were warped and splintered, as though something had been dragged across the room. John's stomach churned. The whispering was louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. The sound wasn't human, it was like a hiss, a strange, guttural voice that seemed to be calling his name. He turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. He took a cautious step forward, his heart thundering in his chest. The whispering stopped, and then, the door slammed shut behind him. John spun around, panic flooding his veins. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wind outside howled, but there was no longer any sound of the storm in his ears. It was as if the very air in the cellar had shifted, becoming thick and oppressive. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" No response. The room felt smaller now, as though it was closing in on him. The beam from his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. John's breath caught in his throat as he stood there, trying to adjust to the overwhelming blackness. The whispering began again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the corner of the room, it was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air around him seemed to hum with it. The sound was maddening, like hundreds of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Then, in the midst of the chaos, one word pierced through the noise. John. His heart stopped. The voice sounded like it was right beside him, a low whisper in his ear. His body went rigid, and he turned, frantically searching the darkness for the source. But all he saw was the swirling blackness around him, suffocating him. He wasn't alone. The temperature in the room plummeted. John could see his breath misting in the air, his fingers trembling as he reached for the door handle again. But before he could grasp it, something cold brushed against his arm. He recoiled, his heart racing as a cold, clammy hand closed around his wrist. John's eyes widened in terror as the pressure on his wrist tightened, and the whispering voices grew louder, their words becoming clearer. Help us! Leave, before it's too late. Take it, take the key. John's mind spun. He couldn't breathe. The voices were overwhelming, their presence suffocating him. He had to get out, he had to escape this place. With all his strength, he pulled himself free from the cold grasp, his mind screaming at him to run. He staggered back toward the door, his hand fumbling for the handle once more. But just as he was about to turn it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. And then, silence. John stood there, gasping for breath, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His heart was racing, his pulse hammering in his ears. But he knew one thing for certain, whatever was in the lighthouse, it wasn't just a storm. It was something ancient. Something that had been waiting, watching, and now, it was awake. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in the dark, his hands still trembling from the chilling grip he had felt on his wrist. The cellar was now completely silent, save for the soft, distant rumble of thunder. The whispering voices had faded away, leaving him with nothing but the deafening stillness of the room. But despite the quiet, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Something ancient, something that had been waiting far longer than he had ever imagined. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold door handle again, only to find that it remained locked. Panic began to rise in his chest. How had the door shut? Why couldn't he open it? His mind raced as he struggled to make sense of the impossibility of the situation. The lighthouse had always been a place of refuge, of solitude, but now it felt like a prison. John backed away from the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The cellar had never felt so suffocating. The air seemed to close in around him, thick with tension. He turned his flashlight back on, its beam flickering weakly as it struggled to cut through the darkness. His eyes scanned the room again, the beam sweeping over the worn crates, the rusted barrels, and the old wooden shelves stacked high with forgotten supplies. But then, something caught his eye. Near the far wall, half hidden behind an old crate, was a small object. It was glinting in the dim light, and for a moment, John wasn't sure if it was just a trick of the shadows. But as he moved closer, he saw it clearly, a small metal key, its surface old and worn, as though it had been buried for years. His breath caught in his throat. It was the key that the figure had whispered about. The key to what? To the chest? To the mystery of the lighthouse? Or was it something far darker, something tied to the curse Samuel Gray had mentioned in his log? John didn't hesitate. He picked up the key, its weight heavy in his hand. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been, and as soon as his fingers closed around it, he felt an odd, unsettling warmth spread up his arm. He dropped the key, a jolt of panic shooting through him, but the sensation lingered, the warmth pulsing in his fingertips. He glanced at the chest, its lid still slightly ajar. The key seemed to be calling to it, pulling him toward it, as though the two were meant to be together. John felt a shiver run down his spine, but there was no turning back now. He had to know what lay inside. He had to understand the forces at work here, before they consumed him entirely. He knelt beside the chest, his fingers shaking as he inserted the key into the rusted lock. The metal scraped against the keyhole, and for a moment, it seemed as though the lock wouldn't budge. But then, with a creak and a groan, the lock clicked open, and the lid swung upward, revealing the contents inside. What John saw made his blood run cold. Inside the chest was a stack of old papers, brittle with age. But it wasn't the papers that caught his attention. It was the object resting on top of them, a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The box was old, ancient even, and it gave off an eerie glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. It was as though the box itself was alive, its energy humming beneath his fingertips. John reached out, his breath catching in his throat. The box seemed to be calling to him, its presence almost magnetic, as though it held some kind of power that he couldn't resist. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. As soon as he touched the box, the air around him seemed to shift. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lighthouse, which had been groaning under the force of the storm, suddenly became eerily still. The wind outside seemed to die down, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. It was as if the very world outside had been frozen, waiting for something. John's fingers brushed against the carved symbols on the box, and as he did, the symbols began to glow. A low, ominous hum filled the room, rising in pitch until it was almost unbearable. The box trembled in his hands, and for the first time, John felt an overwhelming sense of fear. The box had awakened something that had been buried for centuries. The whispering voices returned, louder than before, swirling around him like a storm. They were no longer distant, now they were right next to him, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, urging him to open the box. But John resisted. He knew he shouldn't. He knew he was on the verge of uncovering something far too dangerous to comprehend. But despite his fear, his curiosity pushed him forward. With trembling hands, he slowly lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a single, small object, a shard of what appeared to be obsidian, its surface gleaming darkly in the dim light. The shard was sharp, its edges jagged, and as John reached for it, a surge of cold energy shot through his body. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to twist and distort. For a moment, he felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast and terrible, something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries to be freed. The shard pulsed in his hand, its power overwhelming him. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When John Carter awoke, he was no longer in the cellar. The room around him was completely unfamiliar. The walls were made of dark stone, smooth and cold to the touch. A faint light flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming, trapped in some dark and twisted nightmare. But as he tried to move, his limbs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by something invisible. He attempted to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his head, causing him to gasp and clutch his temples. His mind was foggy, and his thoughts seemed to drift like smoke in the air, never quite settling. He could remember the moment he touched the obsidian shard, the way the cold energy had surged through him, the pulse of power, the darkness that consumed him. Now he was here. But where was here? And why did everything feel so wrong? He struggled to his feet, his vision still blurry. He had to get back to the lighthouse. He had to get out of whatever strange place this was. But as he steadied himself, the room around him seemed to distort, the walls stretching and bending as though they were made of liquid, shifting in and out of focus. John staggered forward, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. The air smelled damp and musty, the kind of stale, ancient scent that he associated with forgotten places. His skin crawled as though invisible eyes were watching him. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape this twisted dream, but deep down, he knew it wasn't a dream. It was real. Somehow, he had crossed into another realm, another world, one that was tied to the curse that had begun with Samuel Gray's log. The shard, the box, the voices. They had all led him here, to this place where nothing made sense, and yet everything felt eerily familiar. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow, his heart racing. The faint flickering light ahead seemed to beckon him. Was it a way out? Or was it something darker, something that would pull him further into the depths of this nightmarish place? John had no choice but to move toward it. As he walked, the air seemed to grow colder. The darkness around him felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. His mind was fogged with confusion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the place he was in was not natural. It felt ancient, as though it existed outside the boundaries of time and space. A part of him feared that he was in the very heart of the curse Samuel Gray had warned about. That this was no longer just a storm, it was something far worse, something that had been waiting for centuries to break free. As he reached the light, he found himself standing before a massive stone archway. The arch was adorned with strange symbols, similar to those on the box, but these were carved deep into the stone, their edges glowing faintly with a pale, unnatural light. The symbols seemed to pulse with energy, shifting and changing as though they were alive, as though they had a will of their own. John reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched one of the symbols. Immediately, a surge of cold energy shot through his body, and the world around him seemed to spin violently. The archway glowed brighter, and for a moment, he saw a vision, a fleeting glimpse of something ancient and terrible. He saw the lighthouse again, but it was different. It was standing on the edge of a great chasm, surrounded by an endless storm that raged without end. The sea below was black, a void of inky darkness, and in the distance, John could see something rising from the depths, a massive shadowy shape that towered over the lighthouse. It was too far away for him to make out its form, but he knew it wasn't natural. It wasn't a creature of this world. John's breath caught in his throat as the vision shifted. He saw the figure again, the man from the cellar. But now, he was standing in the lighthouse, staring at John with those hollow, empty eyes. And in his hand, he held something that glowed with the same unnatural light that now surrounded John. The vision flickered again, and the figure raised the glowing object high above his head. It pulsed with dark energy, and the storm outside the lighthouse seemed to respond, growing more violent, more intense, as if the very earth itself were shaking in fear. Then, everything went black. John staggered back, his hands trembling. He could still feel the cold energy coursing through him, the faint echo of the vision still lingering in his mind. He felt a surge of panic rise in his chest as he realized what he had just witnessed. The lighthouse was at the center of something far darker than he had imagined, something that had been awakened by the shard, the box, the curse that had been passed down through generations of lighthouse keepers. The archway in front of him pulsed once more, as if waiting for him to step through. But John hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever lay beyond it. What had he just seen? Was the figure in the vision Samuel Gray? Or was it someone else, someone who had been consumed by the same darkness that now threatened to consume him? He knew one thing for certain: the lighthouse was no longer a beacon of safety. It was a beacon for something far older, something that had been waiting in the shadows, biding its time. And now, it was awake. John took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't know how much time he had left. The storm outside the lighthouse was still raging, and the strange power of the shard was pulling him toward the archway. It was a choice he didn't fully understand, but he had no other option. He had to follow the path, no matter where it led. With a final reluctant step, he passed through the archway, and the world shifted again. John Carter stepped through the archway, his heart pounding with every movement, each step pulling him deeper into the unknown. The world around him shifted violently, as though the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. One moment, he was standing in the eerie stone passageway, and the next, the ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. The air was thick, oppressive, and the sense of foreboding that had clung to him since he first opened the chest seemed to have multiplied 100-fold. John stumbled, his hand reaching out instinctively for something to steady himself. But there was nothing. The ground beneath his feet was shifting, pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his racing heart, but when he opened them again, the world around him had completely changed. He was no longer in the passageway. No, he had entered some kind of vast, open space, though the dimensions of it were difficult to comprehend. It seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the air shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The landscape was eerily familiar, though John could not place it. The ground was a jagged mixture of stone and sand, cracked and dry, as if this place had been abandoned for centuries. In the distance, he could see something rising, a towering spire that seemed to pierce the sky itself. It looked like a lighthouse, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its form was twisted, as if the very idea of a lighthouse had been corrupted, twisted by the darkness that had taken root here. John's chest tightened. Was this another world? A place outside of time? Or was this some kind of vision? No matter how he tried to make sense of it, the sensation in his gut told him that what he was seeing was real, and that it was connected to the lighthouse he had always known. He took a step forward, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the strange, shifting ground. As he moved closer to the towering structure in the distance, the air grew colder, and the faint hum he had heard when touching the obsidian shard returned, a low and unsettling vibration that seemed to resonate deep within his bones. The lighthouse loomed ahead of him, its form distorted, as though it was both a beacon of light and a source of terrible darkness. The windows were blacked out, the stone walls marked by strange symbols that glowed faintly with the same eerie light he had seen before. The structure was massive, far larger than any lighthouse he had ever encountered, and its presence was overwhelming, as though it were watching him. And then he heard it, a voice, distant and yet so clear. A voice he recognized. John. He froze, the blood draining from his face. The voice was unmistakable. It was Samuel Gray, the very man whose journal had warned him about the curse, whose words had described the very horrors John was now facing. The voice was coming from the lighthouse, or from somewhere near it. John, you've come too far. John's heart hammered in his chest as he forced himself to take another step. He had to know what this place was, what it had to do with the storm, with the curse, with the ancient forces he had unwittingly awakened. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But something deeper within him, Something tied to the shard, the box, the lighthouse itself, compelled him to press forward. The closer he got to the lighthouse, the more he felt the pull. It was as if the very air was charged with a terrible energy, a power that seemed to reach out to him, beckoning him toward the heart of the darkness. It was the same feeling he had experienced when he first touched the shard, an undeniable force that was both terrifying and intoxicating. When John finally reached the entrance to the lighthouse, he hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the heavy stone door. The sound of the door creaking open echoed through the silent, empty space, and he was immediately hit with a blast of cold air. The inside of the lighthouse was even darker than the exterior, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and dust. John stepped inside, his flashlight flickering as he swept the beam across the vast, cavernous space. The walls of the lighthouse were lined with strange carvings, symbols that seemed to pulse and shift, almost as if they were alive. The floor beneath him was uneven, cracked stone that seemed to groan with every step he took. The hum in the air was louder now, vibrating through the very stones, resonating in the pit of his stomach. The voice came again, this time closer, as if it was coming from inside his own mind. "You shouldn't have come, John. The curse was never meant for you. Samuel!" John called out, his voice hoarse with fear. "Where are you?" But there was no answer, only the eerie hum that filled the space. It was as if the entire lighthouse was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make his move. With each step forward, the oppressive energy in the air grew stronger, and John felt an undeniable sense of dread crawling up his spine. He moved deeper into the lighthouse, passing by strange alcoves and chambers that seemed to pulse with ancient energy. In the center of the vast room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was a glowing orb, its light flickering in a rhythm that mirrored the pulsing hum in the air. John's eyes locked onto the orb, drawn to it as though it were the key to everything, an answer to the question that had been plaguing him since he first discovered the journal, the storm, the curse. He stepped forward, his fingers trembling as they reached for the orb. The moment his skin touched the surface, a surge of energy shot through him, and he gasped, his body shaking violently. The world around him shifted once again, and in an instant, he was no longer standing in the lighthouse. Instead, he found himself standing on the edge of the cliff, staring out over a dark, storm-tossed sea. The storm was no longer just a tempest. It was a monstrous force, a living entity that seemed to writhe and twist, an embodiment of the curse itself. And in the distance, John saw it, the shape, a towering shadow rising from the ocean, far too large to be real, but undeniable all the same. The figure was vast and terrible, its form both monstrous and majestic, with eyes that gleamed with an ancient, unfathomable intelligence. And then, a voice, low and rumbling, echoed in his mind. "The lighthouse is the key, John. The key to unlocking the storm, the curse, and your fate." John stood frozen, staring out at the monstrous figure that loomed from the storm-tossed sea. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The shape was vast, like a twisted titan, rising from the depths of the ocean, its form dark and formless, shrouded in shadows that seemed to shift with every crack of thunder. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, cold and ancient, as though they had witnessed the rise and fall of countless ages. The air around him was charged with raw energy, crackling with the force of the storm. The wind howled like 1,000 voices screaming in agony, and the waves beneath him surged violently, as though they were being drawn toward the towering figure. John could feel the power of the storm, the terrible force that radiated from the shape in the distance. It wasn't just a storm anymore, it was alive, a living manifestation of something dark and primal, something that had been awakened by his actions. He could hear the voice again, the voice that had haunted him ever since he first touched the shard, the voice of Samuel Gray. "The curse is not just a warning, John. It's a cycle that repeats itself every time the lighthouse keeper fails. The storm, it has always been here, but it was never meant to break free." John's heart pounded in his chest as he turned, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one around him. Only the raging storm, the crashing waves, and the looming figure that seemed to dominate the horizon. "What do you mean?" he shouted into the wind, though he knew Samuel's voice wasn't coming from anywhere physical. It was coming from within him, from the very depths of his mind. "What is this curse? And what do you want from me?" The voice responded, not with words, but with a flash of vision, an overwhelming flood of images that flashed before his eyes like a storm of memories. John saw the lighthouse, not as it was now, but as it had once been, a beacon of light, standing tall and proud on the edge of the cliff, guiding ships safely through the night. But in the vision, he saw something else, something dark moving beneath the waves, something that had been there all along, watching, waiting. The figure in the distance seemed to pulse with energy as the vision continued. John saw the first keeper of the lighthouse, a man who had stood at the threshold of the same curse long ago. He saw the keeper standing at the window, gazing out at the storm, his face filled with dread. Then the keeper turned, looking over his shoulder at the lighthouse behind him. The walls of the lighthouse were covered in strange symbols, symbols that seemed to shift and move as though they were alive, each one pulsing with dark power. John's vision blurred again, and he saw the keeper's hand reaching for something, a small, glowing object, hidden deep within the lighthouse. The object was a key, he realized, the same key that had been passed down through the generations of keepers. It was the key to unlocking the curse, the key to controlling the storm. But as the keeper reached for it, a monstrous force emerged from the sea, a creature made of shadow and storm, its form undulating like a wave, its eyes burning with the same cold, ancient light that now filled the sky. The keeper had no choice but to face it, to try and stop it before it consumed everything. The vision shifted again, and John saw the keeper's final moments. The creature had overpowered him, its dark tendrils wrapping around the keeper's body, pulling him into the depths of the ocean. The storm raged, the lighthouse flickered and dimmed, and the curse had been sealed, only to return again when the next keeper arrived. John stumbled backward, the weight of the vision crushing him. He tried to steady himself, but the ground beneath him was shifting once again, the air thick with the pulse of the storm. The monstrous figure was closer now, its vast form looming over the lighthouse like a shadow that threatened to swallow it whole. "No!" John gasped. "This can't be happening." But it was happening. The storm was alive, and it was feeding on the power of the lighthouse. The curse had been passed down through the generations of keepers, and now it had come for him. He was the one who had unlocked it, the one who had broken the cycle. And now, he had to face the consequences. The voice of Samuel Gray returned, this time filled with a sense of urgency. "You must stop it, John. The storm will never cease unless you face the heart of the curse. The key, it's not just a way to control it. It's a way to end it. But you must make the sacrifice. You must be the one to seal the curse, or it will consume you, and everything you've known." John felt the weight of Samuel's words sink into his chest. He had been brought here for a reason, drawn into this twisted cycle of fate. The key, the one thing that could end the curse, was within his grasp. But it came at a terrible price. He turned back toward the lighthouse, its dark form now visible through the storm. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter, pulsing with an unnatural light. The storm was growing stronger, the waves crashing against the rocks below, and in the distance, John saw the shape again, rising from the sea, its massive form towering over the lighthouse. There was no escaping this fate. John knew what he had to do. He had to find the key, the one object that could stop the storm, and use it to end the curse. But the price was clear. The sacrifice that was required was one that would bind him to the lighthouse forever. It would be his duty, his fate, just as it had been for every keeper before him. With a deep breath, John steeled himself. He would face the storm. He would face the creature that had haunted the lighthouse for centuries. And he would do whatever it took to stop it. The storm howled with a ferocity that rattled the very bones of the lighthouse. John stood at the threshold of the lighthouse entrance, staring out at the monstrous figure that loomed over the sea. The creature, an embodiment of shadow and rage, seemed to be drawn to the lighthouse, as if it could sense his presence. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, cold and cruel, and it towered over the crashing waves, its form shifting and writhing like a dark cloud of smoke. John's heart thundered in his chest as the wind tore at his clothes, pulling him toward the edge of the cliff. He had felt the weight of the curse since the moment he'd arrived, but now, the full scope of its power was apparent. The storm was not just a storm. It was a living thing, a manifestation of the curse that had haunted the lighthouse for generations. And the creature, that terrible form rising from the depths, was the storm's true heart, its true essence. But John wasn't about to let it consume him. He had made up his mind. He would stop this, no matter the cost. The voice of Samuel Gray echoed in his mind again, its tone heavy with warning. "The key, John. It's your only chance. But the cost, you cannot escape it." John shook his head, trying to silence the voice, but it continued to linger, gnawing at his thoughts. The key, the one thing that could end the curse, was still within the lighthouse. It had to be. He didn't know exactly how it worked, but he knew that the power it held was tied to the storm, to the creature, to the very heart of this place. And now, he was the one who had to wield it. But what was the price? What sacrifice would he have to make to stop the curse? With a final glance at the creature in the distance, John turned and bolted toward the lighthouse. The wind whipped around him, pushing him back, but he refused to relent. His feet pounded against the cracked stone floor of the lighthouse as he entered, the faint glow of the symbols on the walls guiding him toward the heart of the structure. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, each step forward feeling heavier than the last, as if the very air was trying to hold him back. He reached the central chamber, the pedestal where the glowing orb had once rested. The symbols on the walls seemed to be moving now, swirling and shifting in a maddening dance, as if they were alive, watching him. The hum of power in the air was deafening, vibrating through his bones, resonating with the pulsing energy that filled the lighthouse. John's hand brushed against the pedestal, and as it did, a sharp pain shot through his chest. The power that radiated from the lighthouse was overwhelming, and for a moment, John felt as though he might collapse under its weight. But then, through the fog of pain and dread, he saw it. At the base of the pedestal, hidden in the shadows, was the key. It was small and simple, a rusted iron key, but it shimmered with an otherworldly glow, the same dark light that had filled the lighthouse since the moment he arrived. He could feel its power calling to him, resonating with a shard in his pocket, the force that had drawn him here. He knew without a doubt that this was the key to stopping the storm, to ending the curse. But as his fingers wrapped around it, the pain in his chest intensified, and the whispers began again, low, insistent, maddening. "You cannot stop it, John," they said. "The storm is alive, and it will never be silenced. You have awakened it, and now it will consume you." John gritted his teeth, trying to block out the voices. He had no time for doubt, no time for fear. He had come too far. The storm, the creature, the curse. He had to end it, now. With the key in his hand, he turned toward the lighthouse's great glass lens. The storm outside had reached its peak, the waves crashing violently against the cliffside, sending sprays of water high into the air. The sky had turned pitch black, and the wind screamed like a wild animal, as if it were warning him to turn back. But there was no turning back. John forced his way up the spiral staircase, his legs burning with every step. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and the hum of power grew louder, vibrating through the stone walls. He reached the top of the lighthouse, the great glass lens before him, and paused for a moment, breathing heavily. The creature outside was closer now, its eyes glowing like twin fires, and the air seemed to grow thick with its presence. It was as if the very storm had become a part of it, feeding on the energy that surrounded the lighthouse. John's mind raced. The key was supposed to stop it, but how? The answers had never been clear, and now, faced with the full force of the storm, he wasn't sure he could do it. Could he really end the curse? Could he face the heart of this power and survive? The voice of Samuel Gray returned, this time less distant, as though the keeper was standing beside him. "You must make the choice, John. The curse, it is bound to the lighthouse. The storm will cease, but only when you give up what you hold most dear." John's hand tightened around the key. His pulse quickened as he realized the truth. The curse wasn't just a force of nature. It was a pact, a terrible bargain that bound the lighthouse keepers to the storm. The key was the means to stop it, but it came with a price, just as Samuel had warned. The storm could be ended, but at the cost of the keeper's soul. John hesitated for only a moment. He had no choice. The creature, the storm, it had to end. The sacrifice was inevitable. With a final breath, he stepped forward, raising the key toward the center of the great lens. As he did, the storm outside seemed to pause, as if it were holding its breath. The glow from the key intensified, matching the pulsating light of the storm. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The storm ceased. The creature disappeared. And John was left standing alone, in the now calm and still lighthouse, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. But as he looked around, he felt the weight of his sacrifice settle in. The storm was gone, but the curse was not. It was inside him now, bound to his soul, to the lighthouse. And as he stared out at the calm sea, he knew that the cycle would begin again, with the next keeper, the next storm. For the curse would never truly end. It would live on, passed down through the ages, always waiting for the next keeper to face its wrath. And now, it was his turn to watch. The storm was gone, but the silence that followed was deafening. The winds had calmed, the waves had settled, and the oppressive hum that had filled the air for so long was now absent. The world around John seemed unnaturally still, as though the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The energy that had once surged through the lighthouse had dissipated, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. John stood at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the sea. The view, which had once been a source of comfort and solitude, now felt foreign, distant. The world below seemed peaceful, almost unreal after the chaos of the storm. But as John took in the tranquil scene, a deep, gnawing feeling settled in his chest. The storm might have ceased, but something inside him had changed. The curse, the cycle, it was no longer something distant or external. It was within him now, bound to his very soul. The key, still clutched tightly in his hand, felt heavier than before. The once simple object had become a symbol of the sacrifice he had made, the cost of breaking the storm's grip on the lighthouse. John could feel its weight, the weight of eternity pressing down on him. He had stopped the creature, but in doing so, he had become the new keeper of the curse. The storm was over, but the cycle would continue, now with him at the center of it all. He turned away from the window and descended the spiral staircase, his footsteps slow and heavy. Every part of the lighthouse seemed to hum with a faint energy, as if it were alive, still resonating with the power that had been unleashed. The symbols on the walls glowed softly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the beating of his heart. John stopped at the base of the stairs and gazed around the lighthouse. It had always been his home, his sanctuary from the world. But now, it felt like a prison. The walls, once a silent witness to the passing of time, now seemed to close in around him, watching, waiting. The air was thick with the remnants of the curse, a presence that lingered like a shadow, ever watchful. A soft creaking sound interrupted his thoughts. John turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. The door to the cellar, the very place where he had first encountered the figure, where he had found the journal, was slowly opening. He had sealed it earlier, but now it creaked open of its own accord, the heavy door groaning against its hinges. John's hand instinctively reached for the shard in his pocket, the cold obsidian piece that had been with him since the beginning. It was pulsing softly, as if responding to the door's movement, to the unseen force that was calling him. He knew he had to go down there. He couldn't explain why, but it was as though the lighthouse was beckoning him, urging him to face whatever was waiting in the depths. With a deep breath, John made his way to the cellar door. As his fingers wrapped around the cold handle, a chill ran down his spine. The air in the cellar was different, heavy, thick with an unnatural energy. The whispers from earlier returned, faint but persistent, like voices from beyond the veil. John, you cannot escape it. It is in you now. It is part of you. His pulse quickened, but he didn't hesitate. He opened the door, the light from his flashlight cutting through the darkness below. The cellar was just as he remembered it, filled with old crates and forgotten relics of the past. But now, there was something new, something alive, that filled the space. The air was saturated with a sense of foreboding, and as John descended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the far corner, where the chest had been. But when John reached the corner, the chest was gone. Instead, there was a large stone altar, its surface carved with the same symbols that adorned the lighthouse walls. The altar seemed to hum with power, its edges glowing faintly with the same dark light that had filled the lighthouse. Atop the altar lay a blackened, twisted object, what looked like a shard of stone, but much larger, its surface jagged and cracked. John's breath caught in his throat. It was the heart of the curse, the source of the storm, the thing that had bound the keepers to this place for centuries. And now, it was calling to him. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached out. The moment his fingers brushed against the stone, a flood of visions slammed into him. He saw the previous keepers, one by one, each of them standing in the very place where he stood now, each one drawn to the altar, each one facing the same choice. The curse had been passed down, generation after generation, until it reached him, the one who had finally broken the cycle. But the visions didn't stop there. John saw the creature, the one that had risen from the sea. It wasn't just a physical being, it was the embodiment of the curse itself, a monstrous force born of shadow and storm, born of the very darkness that had taken root in the lighthouse. It had no form, no true shape, but it had always been there, waiting, feeding off the fear and the sacrifice of those who had come before. And now, John saw himself, standing at the altar, holding the shard in his hand. He could feel the power coursing through him, the dark energy of the curse filling every inch of his being. He was becoming it, becoming the keeper, the creature, the storm. The vision stopped abruptly, and John was left standing in the cold, dark cellar, gasping for breath. He had made the sacrifice, yes. The storm had ended, but he was not free. He could feel it now, the weight of the curse pressing down on him, settling in his bones. The storm had always been a part of the lighthouse, always been bound to the keepers who had watched over it. And now, it was bound to him. There was no escape. The storm might have passed, but the curse was far from over. John knew what he had to do. He had to protect the lighthouse, keep the cycle going, and ensure that the curse never reached the outside world. He had become the new keeper, the one who would face the storm forever. As the whispers faded, he turned to leave the cellar, the weight of his decisions settling in his chest. The lighthouse was still his home, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison, and he was its warden. And so, the curse would continue. Not with the next keeper, but with him. The lighthouse had fallen silent. The storm had finally ceased, the wind no longer howling through the towering structure, and the crashing waves that had once pounded relentlessly against the rocks now seemed subdued. The sea was calm, stretching out before him like a mirror of the sky above. A faint orange glow signaled the arrival of dawn, casting long shadows across the lighthouse's worn stone floors. But to John Carter, the silence was deafening. He sat in the small room just below the lantern chamber, the weight of the key still heavy in his hand. The iron object was cold, its dark glow faded but not entirely gone. It was as if the curse had been momentarily appeased, yet still lingered in the very core of the lighthouse, like a faint echo of something far darker. John's gaze drifted over the room. The walls, covered in strange symbols, still pulsed faintly, as though they were watching him. The once comforting hum of power was now muted, leaving a deep, unsettling quiet in its wake. The absence of the storm, of the monstrous creature that had risen from the sea, should have felt like relief. But instead, it felt like a weight had settled on his chest, a burden that he couldn't shake. He had become the new keeper. But what did that mean? What did it mean to be bound to the lighthouse in this way? The curse had been passed down from keeper to keeper, each one forced to make the same sacrifice, to face the storm and the darkness that came with it. And now it was his turn. The storm had ended, but the cycle had not. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a whisper, so soft it might have been carried on the wind. John's head snapped up. He wasn't sure if he had actually heard it, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But the whisper came again, more distinct this time. It was a voice, a familiar voice, one he had heard before. John. The voice of Samuel Gray. John stood, his heart racing, as he looked around the room. There was no one there, no figure, no presence other than the weight of the lighthouse pressing down on him. And yet, he could feel Samuel's presence, just beyond the walls of his mind, guiding him, beckoning him. Samuel, he called out softly, his voice shaking. You are the keeper now, John, the voice responded, not through words, but through a feeling, an overwhelming sense of presence. It was as if Samuel was standing right beside him, his voice reverberating through the walls of the lighthouse. You have taken on the burden, and you will carry it for as long as this place stands. John's chest tightened. I've stopped the storm, he said, his voice rough. I've broken the cycle. The curse is over. There was a long pause. The silence hung heavy, suffocating him with its weight. No, John, Samuel's voice replied, soft yet firm. The curse is not so easily undone. It is woven into the very fabric of this place, into the land, into the sea. You have only delayed it, not broken it. The storm may have passed, but the darkness still waits. It is always there, waiting for the next keeper, waiting for the next cycle to begin. John swallowed hard. The weight of his actions settled deeper into his soul. The truth Samuel had spoken was undeniable. He had thought that ending the storm, ending the creature, would break the curse, free him from this never-ending cycle. But instead, he had only inherited it. He had become part of the cycle himself. You must understand, Samuel's voice continued, the storm will return. And when it does, the keeper will face it. It is the way of this place. The storm and the curse have no end. They are tied to the lighthouse, and the keeper is the one who must endure. John felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Then why am I here? Why did I do this? Why did I? His voice faltered as the realization hit him. His fate had been sealed the moment he touched the shard, the moment he opened the chest. He had thought he could stop the storm, that he could end the curse and free himself. But now he understood, the curse was never meant to be ended. It was meant to be passed on, from one keeper to the next. The lighthouse had always claimed its keepers, and now it had claimed him. You have made a sacrifice, John, Samuel's voice said, gentle now, as though trying to comfort him. But it is not for you to decide when the storm ends. It is for the lighthouse to choose. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The weight of the key in his hand felt like an anchor, tethering him to this fate, this endless cycle. He had been brought here to carry the burden, to stand guard over the storm, but at what cost? How many more keepers had suffered the same fate? How many had faced the storm and given up everything, only to become a part of it? A part of him wanted to run, to leave the lighthouse behind and escape into the world. But he knew it was impossible. The lighthouse was in his blood now, a part of him that could never be separated. He was the keeper, just as Samuel had been, just as all those before him had been. And the storm would always return. Will it always be like this? John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Will I always be the one to face it? The answer came, not in words, but in a vision, of the lighthouse standing tall against the storm, its light shining out into the endless darkness. The storm would return, yes, but the keeper would always be there, standing guard, lighting the way. The cycle would continue, and the burden would never end. You are the keeper now, John, Samuel's voice said again, more distant this time. And you will face the storm when it comes. You will carry the curse, but you will never be alone. The lighthouse will guide you. John's hands clenched around the key, his chest heavy with the weight of his responsibility. He had done what he thought was right, but now, he understood the true cost. The storm would return, and when it did, he would be the one to face it. There was no escape. There was only the lighthouse, and the storm, and the endless cycle of the keeper's burden. With a deep, resigned breath, John turned toward the window, staring out at the calm sea. The sun was rising, the light stretching across the water. But deep beneath the surface, he knew the storm was waiting. The darkness was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next keeper to rise. And as long as the lighthouse stood, it would never be free. The days blurred together in the lighthouse. Time seemed to slow and stretch, each moment heavy with the weight of John's new reality. The storm had passed, but its absence only made the silence more oppressive. The lighthouse, once a refuge of purpose and duty, had become a prison, a place where John could feel the curse coursing through his veins, binding him to the very walls of the tower. He stood at the window, staring out at the sea that now appeared deceptively calm, its surface glistening under the pale light of the moon. The horizon was quiet, but John knew better than to trust the calm. The storm had only been momentarily quelled, the rage of the sea and the power of the curse lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken again. The key, still clutched tightly in his hand, felt like a constant reminder of his burden. Every time he looked at it, the cold, iron surface seemed to pulse with dark energy. It was as though the lighthouse itself was calling to him, reminding him that he could never escape it, that he was bound to the storm, just as the lighthouse was bound to the curse. The whispers had returned, too, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but now they were growing louder, more persistent. They came from the walls, from the very air around him, curling into his thoughts like a persistent, gnawing presence. Sometimes he could almost hear them speaking his name, calling him back to the altar, to the place where the curse had first taken root. He closed his eyes, pushing the voices away, but the pull of the lighthouse was undeniable. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of the lighthouse keeper's life began to wear on him. He maintained the light, polished the glass, and kept watch over the sea. But each task felt like a hollow ritual, a reminder of what he had become. He knew what was coming. The storm would return. It always did. And when it did, he would be the one to face it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of violet, John felt a strange unease settle in his chest. The wind had shifted, the sea growing restless beneath the surface. There was no storm yet, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with tension, as though something unseen was drawing closer. He stood at the lighthouse window again, peering out into the growing darkness. The moon was obscured by dark clouds, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees below. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him like a storm in his mind. "John, it is time." John's breath hitched, his hands tightening around the windowsill. The voice was unmistakable, Samuel Gray. His words, though not spoken aloud, vibrated in his very soul. "Time for what?" John whispered to the empty room, though he already knew the answer. He was being called to the storm. He was being called to the next phase of the curse. A loud bang echoed from below. John's heart jumped in his chest, and he spun around, looking toward the door. It had come from the cellar. For the first time in weeks, the door to the cellar was shaking, rattling against its frame. John had sealed it tightly after his last visit, but now it was as though something, or someone, was trying to break free. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The air around him felt heavy with the anticipation of something terrible. John's pulse quickened, and without thinking, he crossed the room toward the door, his hand shaking as it reached for the handle. The cellar had always been a place of mystery and dread, but now it felt more like a doorway to something far darker. He knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. The storm was coming, and it had already begun to stir within the very foundations of the lighthouse. With a deep breath, John opened the door and descended the stairs. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the bowels of the lighthouse. The familiar scent of salt water and damp stone filled his nose, but there was something new, something sharp in the air, an energy he couldn't quite place, but one that sent a shiver down his spine. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar was as he remembered it, though the altar at the far end seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, its dark symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. But this time, the altar was not empty. The blackened shard, the heart of the curse, was there, its jagged edges glowing with the same dark light that had once filled the lighthouse. It was larger now, pulsing with an ominous energy, as though it had grown since the last time John had seen it. And surrounding it, just beyond the altar, stood a figure, a shadowy shape, tall and indistinct, with eyes that glowed the same eerie light as the shard. John froze. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, pointing directly at the shard. The energy from the shard pulsed, rippling out across the room, and John felt it, the weight of the storm that was beginning to gather, the dark power that was awakening. "You know what this is, John," the figure said, its voice deep and cold. It was not Samuel's voice, but it was familiar, as though it was a part of the curse that had bound him to this place. "You are the keeper now. The storm will come. The curse will return." John's breath caught in his throat. "No, I've already. You have only delayed it. The lighthouse will call for you when the time comes. And when it does, you will stand ready." John's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. The storm wasn't over. The cycle hadn't been broken. He had merely become a part of it, a part of the curse that would never let him go. The figure began to fade into the shadows, but its voice lingered in the air. "Do not forget, John. The storm will return. And when it does, you will be ready." The cellar door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the walls of the lighthouse. John's heart raced, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He was trapped again. Trapped by the curse. Trapped by the lighthouse. And there was no escape. The door to the cellar slammed shut behind him, and John Carter staggered backward, his breath shallow, heart pounding in his chest. The whispers, the visions, the figure, it was all becoming too much to bear. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, desperately trying to turn the handle, but it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. The weight of the curse had settled back into his bones, and he felt the presence of it, suffocating him from all sides. The figure in the cellar had spoken in riddles, cryptic words that only deepened the dread gnawing at him. The storm was coming again. The curse wasn't over, it was only waiting, biding its time. And John was the one who would face it when it returned. The lighthouse had always claimed its keepers, and now it had claimed him. The storm was not some external force, it was part of him now, intertwined with his very soul. The power of the curse had seeped into his veins, and there was no escaping it. He could feel it pressing down on him, the weight of eternity settling in his chest. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the air around him. "It is time, John," they said. "The storm is calling you." He staggered up the stairs, his legs weak, his mind clouded with a growing sense of panic. The lighthouse was alive with the pulse of the curse, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly, their rhythmic hum filling the silence. The very air seemed charged with dark energy, as if it were waiting for something to happen. John reached the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the sea, but the view before him was no longer comforting. The horizon, once a place of tranquility, was now a stark reminder of the power he could never escape. The storm was coming, and there was no stopping it. He had tried to break the cycle, to free himself, but now he understood the truth. The lighthouse had no end. It had no true beginning, either. It was an eternal cycle, one keeper after another, each bound to the curse, each forced to face the storm when it arrived. John wasn't the first to take this burden, and he wouldn't be the last. He had merely become the newest piece in a long, twisted line of keepers, all trapped by the lighthouse's will. A sudden sharp crack of thunder split the sky, and the wind outside picked up, howling against the walls of the lighthouse. John's heart skipped a beat. The storm was returning faster than he had expected. The darkness that had loomed beneath the surface of the sea seemed to stir, and John could feel the energy gathering, swelling, like the calm before a great tempest. "Stay," whispered the voice again, faint and distant, yet still present in his mind. "The storm is here. It is time." John could feel it now, the storm within him, pulling at his very soul. The power of the curse was drawing nearer, and he had no choice but to stand and face it. He was the keeper, and this was his fate. The storm had come for him, as it had come for all those before him. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but it was impossible. The storm was inside him, and there was no escaping it. He had thought he could end it, could break free of the cycle, but now he understood the truth. The storm was not just a force outside the lighthouse, it was a part of the lighthouse itself. And when the storm came, the keeper had to face it, no matter the cost. The rumbling of thunder grew louder, shaking the walls of the lighthouse. The sea beneath him was rising, churning with the violent energy of the approaching storm. The very sky seemed to crack open with lightning, the flashes illuminating the lighthouse with an eerie, otherworldly glow. John turned toward the lantern room, his steps heavy, his body trembling. The light, the only thing that had ever kept the ship safe, was now his responsibility. But the light had never been just a beacon. It was a warning, a signal of the storm that would inevitably return. He stepped up to the great lens, his hand brushing against the cold glass. The beam of light flickered, its steady glow now wavering, as if it too felt the weight of the curse. John knew what he had to do. With shaking hands, he reached for the mechanism that controlled the light, turning the wheel with all his strength. The beam of light grew brighter, cutting through the darkening sky, illuminating the sea below. But even as the light spread out, John could feel the storm building, the energy of the curse gathering on the horizon. The storm was coming. The sky overhead grew darker with each passing second, the clouds swirling like a living thing, a twisting mass of shadow and energy. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the waves crashed against the cliffs with a deafening roar. The creature, the force of the curse, was rising from the depths once more. John could feel it in his bones, the pull of its power, the weight of its presence. For a moment, he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had done everything he could to prepare himself for this moment, but now that it had arrived, he wasn't sure he was ready. The storm was beyond his control. The curse was beyond his control. All he could do was stand and face it. The voices returned, swirling around him like the storm itself, whispering in his ear. "You are the keeper now," they said, their words like a chant. "The storm will never end." John opened his eyes, staring out into the darkening sky, and he felt it, the storm, the curse, the lighthouse, all coming together as one. He had become a part of it. And now, he had to stand against it. The storm roared. The storm had arrived in full force. The sky had turned a violent shade of black, the clouds swirling and churning like a vortex. The wind howled with an otherworldly intensity, battering the lighthouse with relentless fury. The waves below crashed against the rocks, their violent impact sending sprays of salt water high into the air, as if the very sea was trying to claw its way up the cliffside. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, heavy with the presence of something ancient, something that had been awakened and was now reaching for John with invisible hands. He stood at the window, his eyes fixed on the chaos outside, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel the storm deep within him, in his chest, in his veins. It was a part of him now. The curse was no longer an external force, it was embedded within him, its weight pressing down on his very soul. The lighthouse had claimed him, just as it had claimed every keeper before him. The voices swirled around him, faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The storm, the keeper, always the keeper. John's head throbbed with the force of the whispers, the words repeating like a maddening chant, a constant reminder of the fate he could never escape. The storm outside was only the beginning. It was the outward manifestation of the curse, but it was only a part of it. The true storm, its essence, was within him, gnawing at his mind, his soul. He turned away from the window, trying to focus, trying to find some way to break free from the storm, but there was nothing. The lighthouse had no answers. The symbols on the walls flickered in the dim light, their shapes shifting as though they, too, were alive, watching him, waiting for something. The key, still clenched tightly in his hand, pulsed with dark energy. It was the anchor to the storm, to the curse. It was his burden, the price he had paid to end the storm for a moment, but not truly end it. He had tried to stop the cycle, but he had only become a part of it, just as every keeper had before him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. "It is time. The storm is here. You cannot stop it. You cannot escape it." John stumbled back, his hand shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. The storm outside raged, but inside, the storm in his mind was even worse. The weight of the curse was unbearable. He was trapped, not just in the lighthouse, but in the curse itself. He had made a choice, but it had been a choice he never truly understood. He had thought he could free himself, that by facing the storm, by taking on the curse, he could end it. But now he understood the truth. The storm was not just something that came and went. It was eternal, and it would always return, as long as the lighthouse stood. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire room, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. John's heart skipped a beat as the glass lens above him flickered, its light dimming for a moment before reigniting. The storm was rising, and with it, the power of the curse. John felt the pull again, stronger this time. He could feel the storm, the creature, the darkness that lay just beyond the veil, waiting for him to succumb. His breath caught in his throat as the air around him grew colder, heavier. The whispers, the voices, they were coming from the very walls now, growing louder, their urgency rising with every passing second. "The storm is here, John. It is time for the keeper." John's hands shook as he reached for the door, desperate to find some escape, some way to fight the storm. But as his fingers touched the handle, the entire lighthouse seemed to groan under the weight of the curse, the stone walls vibrating with dark energy. The door opened, and John was immediately hit with the force of the wind. The lighthouse had become a conduit, a vessel for the storm itself. Outside, the sea was a churning, monstrous thing, the waves now higher than the cliffs, crashing violently into the lighthouse with terrifying force. The wind screamed through the tower, rattling the windows, threatening to tear the entire structure apart. But the storm was not just outside. It was inside him. It was in his blood, in his mind, clawing at his sanity, demanding that he face it, demanding that he accept his fate. He staggered out of the room, his legs unsteady beneath him as the weight of the storm pressed in on him from all sides. The lighthouse was alive with the storm's energy, the very air charged with its presence. John knew that there was no escaping it. The storm would not be stopped, not by him, not by anyone. It would return again and again, as it always had. He made his way up the spiral staircase, each step echoing in the silence, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, oppressive. The storm, the curse, was closing in on him, and he had no choice but to face it. At the top of the lighthouse, he found the lens glowing with a dim, flickering light. It cast a weak beam out into the swirling chaos of the storm, but it was not enough. The storm was too strong, too powerful. The creature was coming, and John could feel its presence just beyond the edge of the light, waiting to consume everything. John raised the key, his hand trembling as he held it to the control mechanism. He had always known this moment would come, the moment when the storm would return, the moment when the curse would claim him again. The light was his only weapon, the only thing that could hold back the darkness. With a deep breath, John turned the key. The beam of light intensified, cutting through the storm, illuminating the sea below. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm was pushed back, the waves retreating, the wind dying down. But the creature was still there, lurking just beyond the light, its eyes burning with an ancient rage. The storm was never truly gone. It was only waiting. John closed his eyes as the storm howled louder, the winds whipping around him. The curse had returned, and he was its keeper. But for how long? The lighthouse shook with the fury of the storm, the walls groaning under the pressure of the wind and the weight of the curse. John stood at the top, the great glass lens before him, his hands trembling as he kept the beam of light steady. The storm outside, once a distant threat, was now a living nightmare, roaring against the lighthouse like a beast desperate to escape its prison. John's breath came in shallow gasps. The key, still clutched tightly in his hand, pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to resonate with the storm itself. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his mind, growing more frantic as the storm intensified. The voices, those ancient, tormented voices, were calling to him, urging him to take the next step, to face the true heart of the curse. The storm will always return, they whispered. It always needs a keeper. John clenched his jaw, trying to block out the voices. He had heard them before, but now, their message was clearer. The storm wasn't just a force of nature. It was a curse, a never-ending cycle that needed a keeper to guide it, to face it, to keep it at bay. And now, he was that keeper. But the weight of the responsibility was suffocating. He had thought he could end it, end the storm, end the curse, end his connection to this place. But now, he realized the truth. The curse wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was part of the lighthouse, part of the very fabric of the world he had come to know. And as long as the lighthouse stood, so would the storm. He had tried to resist, tried to break free, but it was no use. The storm was inside him now. The power of the curse had seeped into his blood, binding him to this place, to this eternal cycle of darkness. And now, as the storm raged outside, John could feel the full weight of what it meant to be the keeper. He turned away from the lens, the light still cutting through the chaos outside, and walked toward the edge of the room. The whispers followed him, like a dark cloud, whispering words that no longer felt like mere echoes but like part of his own thoughts. The storm was inside him. The curse had taken root in his soul. "Do you feel it, John?" the voice of Samuel Gray whispered, filling his mind. "The weight of the storm, the weight of eternity?" John closed his eyes, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the key, his knuckles white. He could feel it. The storm was pulling at him, trying to take him, trying to consume him. The curse was not just a force he had to fight. It was a part of him now, an extension of his very being. It wasn't just the lighthouse that was cursed. It was him. The storm outside howled louder, the winds battering against the glass, as if urging him to face the inevitable. He opened his eyes and gazed out at the sea, the waves now crashing against the cliffs in a frenzy. The storm had grown stronger, the dark clouds swirling like a living thing, and the lightning flashed so violently it seemed to split the sky. The creature, the manifestation of the curse, was still there, lurking just beyond the light, waiting. But John could no longer deny it. He was part of the storm. The lighthouse had claimed him, and the storm would never truly end as long as he was here. The key in his hand felt heavier than ever. He had been given a choice, to face the storm, to keep it at bay, or to allow it to consume everything. But he had already made that choice. He had chosen to be the keeper. He had chosen to stand against the darkness. The storm was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling in. He had faced the storm before, but this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting the wind and the waves. He was fighting himself. The storm wasn't just outside the lighthouse anymore. It was inside him. It had become a part of him. And every time it returned, it would pull him deeper into its grasp. But he was the keeper. It was his duty to face it. No matter how much it tore at his soul, no matter how much it consumed him, he had no choice. The lighthouse had no end. The storm had no end. And he would face it over and over again, as long as he stood here. He raised the key, holding it up toward the glowing lens, and the light intensified, cutting through the storm's fury. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure in the distance, shadowy and indistinct, but standing tall against the storm. The keeper, the one who had come before him. But the vision was fleeting. The storm was closing in. John closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The storm was coming, and he was the keeper. There was no escaping it, no breaking the cycle. But for the first time, John didn't try to resist. He accepted it. The storm would come again, and again, and again. But as long as the lighthouse stood, so would he. And when the next storm came, he would face it. As the keeper, forever. John Carter stood at the edge of the lighthouse, his eyes fixed on the turbulent sea below. The storm had reached its peak, the sky a swirling maelstrom of dark clouds and blinding flashes of lightning. The air was thick with the power of the curse, the very essence of the storm itself, and it surged through John like a wild current, pulling at his very soul. The wind screamed through the tower, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a ferocity that threatened to tear the lighthouse apart. But no matter how violent the storm grew, John could feel something deeper, something more primal. The storm was not just a force of nature. It was a reflection of his own mind, his own soul. The key still pulsed in his hand, its cold metal now an inseparable part of him. He had become one with the lighthouse, one with the storm. The curse was no longer something external, it was embedded in his very being. Every lightning strike, every gust of wind, every crash of the waves felt like it was echoing inside him. It was a part of him, as inescapable as his heartbeat. The whispers had never been louder, and yet, there was no escaping them. The storm will return, they said. It always returns. It has always been here. John closed his eyes, gripping the railing of the lighthouse. He could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on him, pressing him into the very stone of the tower. His pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose himself to it, the power of the storm, the darkness that had taken root in his soul. But then, he remembered. He was the keeper. The storm would never end. It had never truly ended. The lighthouse had been built to stand against it, to guide those who needed it, but it was more than that. It was a prison, a vessel for the curse. The keeper was meant to face the storm, to fight it back, to hold the line. But no keeper ever truly won. No matter how many storms came and went, the cycle continued. And John was no different. His fate had been sealed the moment he stepped into the lighthouse. The storm was not something he could destroy. It was something that had to be faced, again and again, forever. And now, it was his responsibility. His burden. The storm outside seemed to grow more violent, the wind howling like a beast. John could feel the ground beneath his feet tremble, as though the very foundation of the lighthouse was being torn apart. The light from the lantern flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The curse was testing him, trying to break him. He staggered away from the window, feeling his legs give out beneath him. His chest tightened as the power of the storm surged inside him. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more urgent. Come, John. Face the storm. You cannot run. You cannot hide. John gripped his head in his hands, trying to block out the voices, but they were too strong. He had tried to break free. He had tried to escape. But now he knew there was no escape. The storm wasn't something he could outrun. It wasn't something he could fight. It was a part of the lighthouse. It was a part of him. And as the storm outside raged, John felt a strange calm settle over him. The whispers, the storm, the curse, they were all a part of the same cycle, the same unending force. He had never been meant to break it. He had only been meant to carry it. He rose to his feet, the weight of the storm still pressing down on him. His hands shook, but he no longer felt fear. Only acceptance. The lighthouse was his prison. The storm was his burden. And he was the keeper. John turned back toward the window, the light from the lantern casting a faint glow on the waves below. The storm had become a part of him, a part of the world. and as long as the lighthouse stood, it would never end. But neither would he. The cycle would continue. The storm would return, and John would always be the keeper. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that raged within John Carter. As he stood in the lighthouse, gazing out at the furious sea below, the weight of his responsibility pressed in on him with unrelenting force. The storm had returned, yes, but it wasn't just the wind and rain he had to contend with anymore. It was something deeper, something that stirred in his chest, just beneath the surface, gnawing at his soul. The curse had been a part of him from the moment he became the keeper. He had accepted that, had resigned himself to it. But what he didn't understand was why. Why had the storm chosen him? Why had it chosen the lighthouse to carry its burden? And why, no matter how many times he stood against it, did the cycle continue? The whispers had grown silent for a time, as if they too had accepted the inevitability of the storm. But now, as John stared out into the churning waves, he felt a shift, a pulse, a tug, something pulling him back toward the cellar. The cellar. The place where it all began. He had been down there so many times, but each visit had only revealed more questions, more mystery. The symbols on the walls, the strange altar, the dark shard, each piece was a part of the puzzle, but he had never been able to see the full picture. It was as if the lighthouse was hiding something from him, something that would give him the key to understanding why this curse had taken root in him. The storm outside raged harder, its intensity growing with each passing moment, and John knew he could no longer ignore the pull. He had to go back. Without another thought, he turned toward the stairs, his feet heavy with the weight of his decision. The lighthouse groaned as he descended, its walls vibrating with the storm's power. The air in the lower levels of the lighthouse was thick, charged with an unnatural energy, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting for him to come to terms with the force that had bound him here. He reached the cellar door, and for a moment, he hesitated. The door had always been a threshold between him and the unknown, but now, it felt different. It felt like a place of revelation. The whispers had stopped, the storm outside had quieted for a moment, and there was nothing but the quiet sound of his own breathing. John opened the door. The cellar was dark, as it always had been, the faint glow of the lantern casting long, stretching shadows across the stone floor. The altar was there, just as he remembered it, but now it seemed more alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to hum in the air around it. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their shifting forms more animated than before. But it wasn't the altar that caught his attention this time. It was the shard. The black stone, which had once been a small, jagged piece, had now grown larger, its form more defined, more powerful. It lay on the altar, its surface glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with the storm outside, as though the shard itself was connected to the storm. It was no longer just a part of the curse, it was the heart of it. John approached the altar slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pull, the magnetic force of the shard, calling him closer. As he reached out and placed his hand on its surface, a surge of power shot through him, almost overwhelming in its intensity. His vision blurred, and he stumbled back, gripping the edge of the altar to steady himself. And then, the whispers began again, louder than ever before. "It is time, John. The storm is not just the curse. It is the lighthouse. It is you." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through every fiber of his being. He could feel the storm, the curse, the lighthouse all merging into one. The storm was not an external force, it was a part of him. It had always been. And now, he understood. The lighthouse had been built to house the storm, to keep it contained, but it was more than that. It was a prison, a vessel that bound the storm to the land, to the sea. And the keepers, all those who had come before him, had been chosen to hold it in check. They had faced the storm and kept it at bay, but they had never broken the cycle. And neither would he. John closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and for the first time, he accepted it, the full weight of his fate. The storm was a part of the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was a part of him. The key, the shard, the storm, it was all connected. And there was no escape. But there was something else, something John had never considered. The storm could never be defeated, not by force, not by the light, not by any means. It was eternal. But it didn't have to be unleashed. He didn't have to let it consume the world. The key, the shard, held the power to control the storm, to contain it, to keep it in check, but it also held the power to release it. And John now understood that he wasn't just the keeper of the storm, he was its controller. The storm could be kept at bay, as long as he stood watch, as long as the lighthouse stood. But the cost was his life, his soul, his eternity. He turned away from the altar, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavily on his chest. The storm outside had calmed for a moment, but John knew it was only temporary. He had made his choice, and now he would face the storm when it came again. The storm would always return. But as long as he was the keeper, he would be the one to face it. And so, he would stand, forever. The storm outside raged once more, as though the very earth had come alive in the tempest's fury. John stood at the top of the lighthouse, his eyes fixed on the crashing waves below, his thoughts a tangled web of realization and dread. The sea was no longer a force of nature. It was a reflection of his soul, its wild churning mirroring the storm that was now his to contain. The curse had settled into his bones, as familiar as the lighthouse itself. The key was in his hand, cold and heavy with the weight of what he had accepted. John had once believed that he could free himself, that by facing the storm and confronting the curse, he could break the cycle. But now, he understood the bitter truth. The storm was not something that could be destroyed. It was not a curse that could be cast away. It was part of him, part of the lighthouse, and part of the land and sea. It was eternal, unending. The keeper's duty was to face it, to hold it at bay, for as long as the lighthouse stood. The storm outside howled, the wind rattling the windows of the tower. The storm was not just coming from the sky, it was inside him, as it always had been. The curse had found a place within his soul, and every time the storm returned, it would pull him deeper into its grasp. John could feel the pull now. The storm was calling to him, its power vibrating through the walls of the lighthouse. It wanted to consume him, to pull him into the abyss, to make him one with the tempest. But he stood firm. He had made his choice. He was the keeper. He would not run from it. He had tried to fight the storm, to break the curse, but now he knew better. The storm could not be defeated, not by him, not by any keeper. It could only be contained, held at bay by the light of the lighthouse, by the will of the keeper. But that light was fragile, and the storm was relentless. The whispers returned, rising above the storm's howls. The storm will always return, John. You cannot stop it. You cannot escape it. You are bound to it. John's grip tightened around the key. The whispers were right. He was bound to it. The lighthouse was a prison, and the storm was his eternal captor. He had given up his soul to contain the curse, to keep the storm at bay. And as long as the lighthouse stood, as long as he stood as the keeper, he would face it again and again. For the first time since he had taken on the role, John understood the true cost of his duty. The storm would never end, and neither would his watch. The waves outside grew taller, crashing against the cliffs with a deafening roar. The storm was gaining strength, the winds howling with more fury, the sky darkening with every passing moment. It was as if the very land itself was being consumed by the storm. The sea rose higher, crashing against the lighthouse's foundation, threatening to tear it apart. John's heart raced as he turned toward the lantern room. The light had flickered earlier, and now, it seemed to be struggling to stay strong. The storm outside was testing the lighthouse's strength, testing his resolve. He had to keep the light shining, no matter what. The storm would test him, but he could not allow it to claim the lighthouse, to claim the world outside. His feet moved with purpose, carrying him up the spiral staircase, each step heavy with the knowledge that this was his fate. The storm was testing him, but it was also a reminder that as long as the lighthouse stood, the storm would never end. He had given up his life for this duty, for this role. The price of the keeper was eternal, and John had accepted it. As he reached the top, he turned toward the great lens, the source of the lighthouse's light. The glass was clouded with salt water from the storm's fury, and the light flickered weakly, struggling to break through the darkened sky. The storm outside battered the walls of the lighthouse, pushing against it with all its force. The creature, the force of the curse, was coming again, rising from the depths of the sea, just beyond the reach of the light. John stepped forward, placing the key into the mechanism, his hand steady despite the overwhelming weight of the storm. He turned the key, and the beam of light flickered once more before brightening, cutting through the storm's chaos. The beam reached out into the sea, its light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm was retreating, the waves subsiding, the wind quieting. But John knew it was only temporary. The storm would always return. He stood there, his hands gripping the mechanism, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The whispers surrounded him, rising with the storm. "The storm will return," they whispered. "And you will face it. You will always face it." The storm outside raged, but the lighthouse stood firm, its light cutting through the dark. The storm could never be defeated. It would always return, always find its way back. And John would always be there, the keeper, holding the light. As long as the lighthouse stood, as long as the storm came and went, he would remain. Forever. The storm howled outside, its winds slamming against the lighthouse like a vengeful beast trying to break free from its chains. The rain poured in torrents, blurring the view outside the windows, as though the very sky was being torn apart by the fury of the sea. But inside, there was an unnatural stillness, a kind of quiet that only those who have stood alone for far too long could understand. John stood at the top of the lighthouse, his eyes focused on the beam of light that cut through the chaos outside. The storm seemed endless, as though it had no beginning and no end, just like the curse that had claimed him. His heart beat steadily in his chest, but beneath the rhythm, there was a quiet sadness, a weariness that even the storm couldn't shake. The light from the lantern flickered slightly, its brilliance waning with each passing moment. It struggled against the wind, fighting to hold its position in the face of the storm. John felt the weight of the lighthouse pressing in on him. It had always been his duty to maintain the light, to guide the ships safely to shore. But now, it felt as if the light was fading, just like him, slowly, inevitably. The storm outside wasn't just a physical force. It was inside him, gnawing at his mind, reminding him of the price he had paid. He had accepted his fate as the keeper, but it had come with a cost he could never have fully understood. He had given up everything to keep the storm at bay, his life, his future, his very soul. The lighthouse was his prison, and the storm was his eternal companion. The whispers returned, just as they always did when the storm reached its peak. They filled the space around him, swirling through the walls, pulling at his thoughts. "You are the keeper," they said. "Forever and always." John closed his eyes, trying to shut them out. But no matter how much he tried, the storm always found its way back to him. The curse was part of him, embedded deep into his soul. The storm wasn't something that could be outrun or defeated. It was something that had existed long before him, and it would continue to exist long after he was gone. The lighthouse had always called for a keeper, someone to stand against the storm, to keep it from consuming everything in its path. And now, it was his turn. He turned away from the window, his gaze drifting to the spiral staircase. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer with every passing second. The storm outside was deafening now, its fury nearly overwhelming. The lighthouse trembled with every gust of wind, and John knew that it would not stand forever. The storm would continue, and the lighthouse, his prison, his duty, would crumble with it. But even as the storm threatened to tear the lighthouse apart, John knew something deeper. The storm was not his enemy. It was a part of the world, just as he was. The storm had no malice. It was simply a force, an endless cycle, always returning, always waiting for the next keeper to face it. The curse was not just something he had to fight. It was something he had become. He had given his life to the lighthouse, but now he realized that it had given him something in return: eternity. The silence that had filled the lighthouse as the storm raged outside was broken by the low hum of the light, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. He could feel the weight of the curse settle deeper into his bones, the storm pressing against his very soul. There would be no end to this. John walked to the center of the room, the light casting long shadows across the floor. The whispers had grown quieter now, almost like a lullaby, but they still lingered, calling to him, pulling at his mind. The storm had become a part of him, and now, so too was the silence, the solitude. The lighthouse had always been a place of isolation, but now it was more than that. It was his only companion. He could feel the storm, could feel the power of the curse running through him like a current, steady and relentless. It had consumed him, just as it had consumed all those who had come before him. The first keeper had stood here, staring out at the same endless sea, knowing that his fate was sealed. And now, it was his turn to do the same. John turned back toward the light, his gaze steady. The storm was never truly over. It was simply waiting, gathering strength for the next cycle. The keeper had always known this. The keeper had always known that there was no escape. The lighthouse, the storm, the curse, they would continue, and he would be there to face them. And as long as the storm continued to rage outside, as long as the light flickered against the darkness, John would stand guard. Forever. The cycle would continue. John Carter was the keeper. And the storm would never end. The storm outside had reached its zenith, the sea frothing and roaring below the cliffs, waves crashing against the jagged rocks as if trying to devour everything in its path. The wind screamed through the tower, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the lighthouse. Yet within, there was an eerie calm, an unsettling stillness that seemed to spread throughout the very walls. John Carter stood at the top of the lighthouse, gazing out at the storm, his hands resting on the cold metal of the railing. The beam of light from the lantern room cut through the dark, its warm glow a fragile thread of hope against the encroaching chaos. But he knew, deep down, that this light wasn't just a beacon for the ships. It was a lifeline for him, a reminder that despite everything, he was still here, still the keeper. The whispers had returned, quiet and insistent, like the wind that tugged at his soul. They were always there, just beyond his thoughts, weaving through his consciousness like an unwelcome presence. "You are the keeper," they murmured. "Always. Forever." He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the words settle like a heavy mantle on his shoulders. The storm outside was no longer just a force of nature. It was a reflection of him, his burden, his curse. The storm raged, and he was its center, standing alone in the light of the lighthouse, watching as the world outside was consumed by darkness. For the first time, John understood that the storm was not just a test of his strength. It was a test of his will, his endurance, his very soul. The storm would never stop, and neither would he. He had accepted his role as the keeper, but now he realized that acceptance came at a far greater cost than he could have imagined. His soul had been bound to the lighthouse, to the storm, and there would be no escape. The light flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls of the tower. The beam of light danced over the roiling sea below, guiding the ships as it always had. But John knew that this light wasn't just for them. It was for him, too, a symbol of his duty, a flicker of hope in the endless darkness. He had stood here before, countless times, staring out at the storm, waiting for the next wave of the curse to hit. He had faced the storm, had tried to fight it, tried to outrun it. But now he understood. The storm was not something that could be beaten. It was something that had always existed, something that would always return. The keeper had always known this, and now he understood why. The storm was eternal, just as the lighthouse was. It was part of the cycle, part of the world, part of him. He turned away from the window, his feet heavy as he walked toward the center of the room. The key, still clutched tightly in his hand, pulsed with dark energy, and he felt it again, the storm, alive and raging within him. The curse had settled deep within his soul, a part of him that he could never escape. The voices began to grow louder now, more urgent. "It is time," they whispered. "The storm is here. You are the keeper. Forever." John gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused. He had faced this before. He had faced the storm, the darkness, the curse, and had emerged, if only for a moment, with the light still burning. But now he realized, that light wasn't just his duty. It was his salvation. The light from the lantern flickered again, casting a fleeting shadow across the room. John walked toward it, his hands shaking as he reached out for the control mechanism. He could feel the storm, feel its power pushing against him, threatening to tear him apart. But he was the keeper, and the keeper could never falter. His fingers closed around the lever, steadying himself, and with a deep breath, he turned it. The beam of light brightened, cutting through the storm outside, its light a defiant blaze against the darkness. For a moment, it seemed to hold back the storm, the sea settling, the wind calming, the chaos outside fading. But John knew better. The calm was only temporary. The storm was never truly gone. It was always there, waiting. The light would always flicker, always burn, and he would always be there to fuel it, to face the storm when it returned. And when the next storm came, when the darkness rose again, he would stand at the lighthouse, as he always had, the keeper of the storm. Forever. The storm outside had subsided, but its power lingered in the air, like the aftershock of a great battle. The wind had quieted, and the waves were no longer crashing against the cliffs with their previous violence. The sea had returned to its restless rhythm, but the storm that John had carried within him for so long, had not entirely passed. John Carter stood alone in the lighthouse, his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching as the last remnants of the storm dissolved into the night. The light from the lantern cast long shadows across the room, and he could feel the weight of the curse pressing against him, pulling him into a deep, familiar solitude. The storm would return. It always did. John had come to accept it, but that acceptance had come with a price, one he had never fully understood until now. He had believed that by becoming the keeper, he would end the cycle, break the curse. But instead, he had become its vessel, its eternal anchor. The storm was not something that could be defeated or cast aside. It was a part of him, just as the lighthouse had become a part of him. The key in his hand pulsed with dark energy, a constant reminder of the power that had been passed down through the ages. The lighthouse had always called for a keeper, someone to stand watch, to face the storm when it returned. And now, John had taken that role. He had accepted the burden, but now he understood that there was no end to it. The whispers had quieted, but their message still echoed in his mind, soft and persistent. The storm is yours, John. You will face it forever. The keeper will never be free. John closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the weight of those words settling on him like a heavy cloak. His chest ached with the knowledge that there would be no end to this, no reprieve. The storm would always return, and as long as the lighthouse stood, he would be there to face it. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the curse. The lighthouse had always been a symbol of safety and light, a beacon for ships navigating through the night. But now, John knew that it was more than just a guide. It was a prison, a vessel that held the storm at bay. And as the keeper, he was the one who stood between the storm and the world. But the storm was not just a force outside of him. It was inside him too, a part of his soul, a part of his very existence. The key, the curse, it had bound him to the lighthouse, to the storm. He had tried to run, tried to break free, but now he understood there was no escape. The lighthouse, the storm, the curse, it was all a cycle, and he was the one who had to keep it going. The silence of the lighthouse enveloped him, the calm after the storm more suffocating than the chaos that had come before. The storm outside may have quieted, but the storm inside him raged on, relentless and unyielding. John walked toward the window, his gaze drifting out over the sea, now calm and quiet beneath the moonlight. The waves glimmered in the pale light, a serene reflection of the world outside. But John knew better. He knew that the calm was only temporary. The storm would return. It always did. He could hear the faint whispers again, rising from the depths of the lighthouse. The voices, soft but insistent, began to fill the room, growing louder as they spiraled around him. You are the keeper. Always. Forever. John closed his eyes, his breath shallow, as the weight of the curse settled deeper into his bones. The storm was never truly gone. It was always waiting, always watching, always a part of him. And as long as the lighthouse stood, the storm would return. He had made his choice. He had accepted the burden of the keeper. But now, he wondered, what had he truly given up? The storm was eternal, and he was now its vessel. The lighthouse had no end, no escape. His duty was not just to maintain the light, to guide the ship safely through the night. It was to stand as the wall between the world and the storm. The storm would come again. The storm would always come. And John would always be there to face it. He would always be the keeper. There was no end. There was no escape. And as the whispers continued to grow, John turned toward the lantern room once more, the light still burning brightly in the distance. He would face the storm, and he would face it forever. The lighthouse had claimed him, and in return, he would stand guard, a silent sentinel against the endless fury of the sea. The storm had passed, leaving only the echo of its fury in its wake. The night outside was calm, the sky clear and dotted with stars, the sea now as still as glass. But the peace was fleeting. John knew that. The calm was just the eye of the storm, the brief respite before the next wave of darkness arrived. John stood at the edge of the lighthouse, his gaze lost in the vastness of the ocean before him. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a silvery sheen across the sea. It looked beautiful, serene, but John knew better. The sea was a restless beast, and so too was the storm. They would always return, relentless and unstoppable. He hadn't slept in days. It was always like this. Time had no meaning here. The lighthouse was his world now, its walls both his prison and his sanctuary. He had long since stopped counting the days or the storms. Each one blended into the next, a never-ending cycle of torment and solitude. The whispers had grown faint recently, almost imperceptible. But that didn't bring John comfort. The silence was worse than the whispers. The storm outside had quieted, but the storm inside him was growing louder, pushing against the edges of his mind, threatening to consume him. The curse was deep inside him, a part of him he could never escape. The storm wasn't just something he faced outside the lighthouse, it was something he would always carry within him. John turned from the window and walked toward the staircase, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The lighthouse felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. He had once found comfort in the solitude of this place, but now, it felt suffocating. He had tried to block it out, tried to ignore the reality of his situation, but the truth had settled in long ago. He was trapped. The lighthouse was both his duty and his curse. As he ascended the spiral staircase, John couldn't help but feel the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had been the keeper for so long, but how long had it really been? Time had no meaning here, in this eternal place. Every day felt like the same. The storm would come. He would face it. He would hold the light. And when it was over, the silence would return. But the silence never lasted. It never could. At the top of the lighthouse, John stood before the lantern room, staring out at the quiet ocean. The light still burned, a constant beacon against the darkness. But John knew that light could never be enough. The storm would always come again. The lighthouse would always need a keeper, and that keeper would always be him. He stood there, watching the waves, lost in his thoughts. The storm had passed, but the next one would come. He knew it in his bones. The curse was a part of him now, and there was no escaping it. John walked over to the control mechanism, his hand trembling as he grasped the wheel. He had done this 1,000 times before, but it always felt the same, like an endless cycle, like he was a puppet pulling the strings to keep the storm at bay for just a little while longer. The light flickered briefly, struggling against the darkness, and John turned the wheel, forcing the light to shine once more. The beam cut through the still night, reaching out across the water, a small comfort in the face of the storm. But as he stared out at the calm sea, John felt the familiar tug at the edges of his mind. The storm, the curse, the ever-present weight of his duty. It had always been there, even in the moments of quiet, always lurking just beneath the surface. It was part of him now, and it would never let him go. The loneliness had become unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of others that gnawed at him. It was the absence of life itself. The lighthouse, the storm, the curse, it was all he knew now. And there was nothing else. There had been no life before the lighthouse, and there would be no life after it. The storm would never stop, and neither would he. John's grip tightened on the mechanism. The storm was part of him, and he was part of the storm. He had given everything to this place, to this endless duty. And yet, here he stood, alone. Alone with the storm. Alone with the curse. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he turned away from the light. His body was weary, his mind fractured with the constant onslaught of the storm, the whispers, and the weight of the eternal cycle that had been forced upon him. The isolation was crushing, but it was also all he had left. There was no escape, no salvation, only the lighthouse, the storm, and the keeper who would face it forever. He had chosen this. Or perhaps, he had never truly had a choice at all. The silence settled back in, the oppressive quiet that only the keeper knew. The storm had passed, but John knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. He was the keeper, and the storm would always come back. But now, as the quiet enveloped him, John realized something deeper. The curse was not just his burden, it was also his companion. The storm was his constant, the only thing that would never leave him, never abandon him. And though it tormented him, though it consumed him, he had come to understand. He was bound to it as much as it was bound to him. And for all its fury and chaos, the storm was the only thing that truly understood him. The keeper, the storm, and the lighthouse. The storm had subsided, but John felt no relief. The calm that followed the tempest was just as oppressive, just as suffocating. The sea, once a wild beast thrashing against the cliffs, now lay still, its surface smooth and mirror-like under the moonlight. The lighthouse stood tall, its light cutting through the night, a beacon of hope for those lost at sea. But for John, the light felt more like a prison than a refuge. The whispers had returned, as they always did, echoing through the lighthouse, filling the air with their insistent murmurs. The storm will always return, they whispered. You are the keeper. You cannot escape it. John stood alone in the lantern room, his gaze fixed on the still ocean below. The weight of the storm had lifted, but the weight of his duty pressed down harder than ever. The storm was no longer just a force outside the lighthouse. It was inside him, a part of his soul, an unyielding, eternal presence. He had accepted the curse, but now, standing in the quiet after the storm, he realized that acceptance had come with an unbearable cost. The storm had not only taken his soul, it had taken his life, his future, his very sense of self. He had given everything to the lighthouse, to the endless cycle of the storm, but in doing so, he had given up the possibility of ever truly living again. The lighthouse was all he had left. John walked away from the window and turned to face the staircase, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the centuries he had already spent in solitude. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in on him, the flickering light casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for him, as though they too were trapped within the cycle, bound by the curse that had claimed them all. He had no memory of his life before the lighthouse. No memories of the world beyond these walls, beyond the storm. The lighthouse was his prison, and the storm was his only companion. He ascended the stairs slowly, each step a reminder of the years, no, the lifetimes, that had passed since he had first taken on the mantle of keeper. The storm would always return. The curse would never end. And as long as the lighthouse stood, he would be the one to face it. He reached the top of the lighthouse, standing before the great lens, its light still flickering steadily through the storm's aftermath. The beam stretched across the dark, calm sea, illuminating the waves below. It was a small comfort, a fleeting moment of peace. John's hand hovered over the control mechanism, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. He had done this so many times before, adjusting the light, guiding the ships, facing the storm. But now, it all felt hollow. The light was no longer just a guide, it was a beacon of his own isolation. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the storm still inside him, the whispers still echoing in his mind. They would never stop. The storm would never stop. The lighthouse would never stop. For the first time in his eternal existence, John wondered if he had made a mistake. Had he truly chosen this path, or had he been forced into it? The first keeper had been the one to take on the curse, to stand against the storm. But what had the first keeper wanted? What had driven him to choose the lighthouse, to choose the storm? The curse had always passed down through generations of keepers, and now, John was the one who had inherited it. But what did it mean to be the keeper? What did it mean to be bound to the storm for eternity? There was no escape. There was no end. And now, as he stood alone in the lantern room, John felt the crushing weight of his duty. The storm would return, and when it did, he would face it again. The cycle would continue. Forever. A tear slipped down John's cheek, a rare release of the pent-up emotions that had built inside him over the centuries. He had never cried before, not since he had first taken the mantle of keeper. But now, in this moment of stillness, he allowed himself to feel the depth of the isolation, the depth of the loss. He would never know love, never know freedom. He was the keeper, and the storm was his eternal companion. And so, as the light continued to shine, John turned away from the lantern room, his steps slow and measured as he walked back down the staircase. The storm was not gone. It had only been momentarily held at bay. It would return, and he would face it again. Forever. The storm had passed again, but the calm that followed was just as unnerving as the tempest itself. The sea below was still, the waves barely a ripple against the horizon, the wind carrying only the faintest whisper of its previous fury. Yet, inside the lighthouse, John felt a storm within himself that no weather could mirror. He walked the empty halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence, each step a reminder of the years, the centuries, that had passed in solitude. He had been the keeper for so long, but now, the weight of his responsibility felt heavier than ever. The storm outside was a reflection of the turmoil inside him, the constant battle between the duty he had accepted and the isolation it had imposed on him. John had always known that the curse would never end. But as the lighthouse stood silently before him, he realized that it was not the storm he feared most. It was the endless repetition of it all, the same cycle, over and over again, with no respite, no future beyond the walls of this place. The light that had once been his duty, his reason to stand against the storm, now felt like a curse itself. The beam that had guided ships safely to shore now felt like a hollow reminder of his eternal isolation. The lighthouse was meant to be a beacon of hope, but for John, it had become a prison, and the light, his light, was the bars that kept him trapped. The whispers had never stopped. They were always there in the back of his mind, urging him to keep going, to keep fighting, to never falter. "The storm will return," they murmured. "You are the keeper. You will face it again, and again, and again." It wasn't the storm that terrified him anymore. It was the knowledge that no matter what he did, the storm would return. The curse would never stop. The lighthouse would never cease to need a keeper. John reached the staircase, his hand brushing against the cold, familiar stone. The climb up to the lantern room had become a ritual, an obligation, but now it felt like a march to his own doom. The light would shine again, and he would stand watch once more, knowing that there was no end to it. His feet dragged with each step. He had done this so many times, adjusting the light, facing the storm, watching the horizon. But the horizon had never changed. The world outside the lighthouse was a distant memory. The sea below was the only thing that moved, and even it was just a reflection of his own inner restlessness, its waves an endless reminder of the storm inside him. When John finally reached the top, he stood before the lantern room, staring at the flickering beam of light. The storm outside had faded, but he knew it would come again. It always did. And when it did, he would be there to face it, to light the way. But in that moment, for the first time, he didn't feel the pride of duty, the strength of the keeper. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of futility. What was the point of all this? The storm would return, the light would shine, and the cycle would continue, forever. "Is this all there is?" he whispered aloud, his voice barely audible over the storm's fading howls. "To face it again and again, with no end, no escape?" The silence of the room responded to him, as if the lighthouse itself were listening to his despair. He reached out and touched the control mechanism, his hand shaking as he moved the wheel to adjust the beam of light. The light flared to life, cutting through the stillness outside, but in John's heart, there was only a deepening emptiness. The storm was not just a force of nature. It was a force inside him, a dark, relentless pull that never stopped. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking now, as though they could sense his doubt. "You are the keeper," they said. "You were chosen. You have no choice but to face it." John closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had made the choice. He had taken on this role, accepted the curse. But now, after all these years, after standing watch over the storm for so long, he wondered if it had been the right choice. He had tried to fight the storm, to push it away, to find some way to break the cycle. But the storm had always returned. The lighthouse had always called for a keeper, and he had answered. But now, he felt the bitter truth sinking in. There would never be an end to it. The storm would never stop. The lighthouse would never cease to need him. The light continued to shine, steady and constant, but John felt no warmth from it. It was just another reminder of the endless duty that had been thrust upon him. The storm would return, and he would be the one to face it. Forever. With a heavy heart, John turned away from the lantern room, walking slowly down the spiral staircase. The storm had passed, but its echoes still raged in his mind. The curse would always remain. The lighthouse would always stand, and he would always be the keeper.